before them. See, today we have in the United States Senate certain people that have been there. We might as well call Robert Byrd, no offense intended, we might as well call him the Earl of West Virginia, because he's been there so long. I mean, it's like he has an established place there. This is not what the Founding Fathers intended at all. And for the obvious reason of the nature of man, that when people are entrenched in a certain position in their lives, that they many times use their power in a tyrannical way. Now, here's a story of somebody who was very instrumental. He was a signer of the Declaration, very instrumental in teaching other of the Founding Fathers. And remember, one of the things that we're discussing here today is the Founding Fathers and the influences that they had on their lives. He was one of the 6 Founding Fathers to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. What a great honor. President Washington appointed him to the Supreme Court. He was born in Scotland. He was an active delegate at the Constitutional Convention, speaking 168 times. There's going to be a test, by the way, at the end. So, do you know who we're talking about? His name was James Wilson. He died in 1798. He was the first law professor of the University of Pennsylvania. And James Wilson wrote in his Lectures on Law, 1789 and 91, which I've read, very interesting stuff, to say the least. Law communicated to us by reason and conscience has been called natural and promulgated by the Holy Scriptures. It has been called revealed, but it should always be remembered that this law, moral or revealed, flows from the same divine source. It is the law of God. So there you have a signer of the Declaration, a signer of the Constitution, paying respect to the law that's revealed in the Scriptures. Now today, a lot of people say, we don't need a Bible. We don't need any of that stuff. That's religion, separation of church and state. Well, James Wilson, who signed both of the foundational documents that we particularly put so much emphasis on, wouldn't agree with that. He said, human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of the law which is divine. And of course, Samuel Adams, who, if you saw the HBO John Adams program, which I don't have a lot of respect for, because it didn't really do a good job of describing one of the greatest men in the time, John Adams, at all. And particularly, it made Samuel Adams look like he was a bumbling fool, which was absolutely as far from the truth as you could possibly get. He said, if men of wisdom and knowledge, of moderation and temperance, of patience, fortitude, and perseverance, of sobriety and true republican simplicity of manners, of zeal for the honor of the Supreme Being and the welfare of the Commonwealth, if men possessed of these other excellent qualities are chosen to fill the seats of government, we may expect that our affairs will rest on a solid and permanent foundation. He recognized who was to be sovereign first. And that's why I said to you, when I make the statement, I will have no other king but King Jesus, I'm recognizing the sovereignty of Christ, but I'm also recognizing my personal sovereignty to be able to say that, both as a person and as an American, so forth. It's also interesting that a couple of professors, Donald Lutz and Charles Heinemann, wrote a study called The Relative Influence of European Writers on Late 18th Century American Political Thought. It was published in the American Political Science Review in 1984. They said this: when indirect Bible citations were included, they were talking about 15,000 writings of the 55 writers of the Constitution, and I believe in the beginning I said 55 signers of the Declaration, that's 57 and 55 signers of the Constitution, including newspaper articles, pamphlets, books, and monographs, that the Bible, especially the book of Deuteronomy, contributed 34% of all direct quotes made by the founders. When indirect citations were included, the percentage rose even higher. Presiding over the Constitution Convention was George Washington, who wrote 10 days after his presidential inauguration to the United Baptist Churches of Virginia in 1789, if I have entertained the slightest apprehension that the Constitution framed by the Convention, where I had the honor to preside, might possibly endanger the religious rights of any ecclesiastical society, certainly I would never have placed my signature in it. And he was talking about another aspect of sovereignty. Many people today have a skewed idea about Thomas Jefferson. But Thomas Jefferson said, whenever people are well informed, they can be trusted. That's why we're here today, certainly. And they can be trusted with their own government. Another aspect of sovereignty, that whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, they may be relied on to set them to rights. And of course, he was actually, this was an indirect reference to Scripture of John 8:32, which, if I was to use it this way, it probably sounds a little more patriotic. Veritas vos liberabit. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Now, a son of the Boston Tea Party, you probably heard of Joseph Story. He was a founder of Harvard Law School. He was a justice in the Supreme Court. He said, where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament? He was appointed to the Supreme Court by James Madison. He said, at the time of the adoption of the First Amendment, the general, if not the universal sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state. The real object of the First Amendment was not countenance, much less to advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects. And of course, how many of us remember this quote from Patrick Henry? He said, it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. For this very reason, peoples of other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and freedom of worship here. How many people realize today, and I certainly can take offense as being a descendant of these ancestors, that now tolerance is a matter of making sure that nobody mentions God, nobody mentions the Bible, take him out of all public life, and take people like me and throw me overboard. Well, excuse me, I'm not going overboard. This is my country, and I believe somebody's stolen it, and I want it back. And I don't commit other people to it, but I have a certain sovereignty to be able to say that. Someone has stolen my country, and I want her back. And see, when you provide these things, a lot of people say, well, I don't like what you're saying. Okay, you don't like it. I didn't say it. You revere Thomas Jefferson, you revere Patrick Henry, you revere all these other people that we've mentioned, Joseph Story, they said it. That's what they believed then. And it's important for us to know, why did they believe these things? Where does it come from? Well, one of the signers of the Declaration was John Witherspoon. He was born in Scotland, and he was a fiery fellow. He was a signer of the Declaration, he was a clergyman, he was a Presbyterian from Scotland, he was the president of the College of New Jersey, known today as Princeton Theological Seminary. He taught many of our founding fathers, including James Madison, Aaron Burr, 3 chief justices of the Supreme Court, 29 congressmen, 29 senators, and 56 state legislators. I think we could say he was a man of influence in the early republic. Couldn't we say that? He said, without political liberty, no religious liberty. He corresponded frequently with George Washington. John Adams had this to say of him. He said, he's the highest son of liberty as any man in America. He also said there needs to be a balance between love of liberty and love of order. Now, one of the great influences on John Witherspoon was a man named Samuel Rutherford. And he wrote a book called Lex Rex, which basically translated, and this was in the 1600s, the mid-1600s, he wrote that book, and it was basically translated in English, The Law and the Prince, a dispute for the just prerogative of king and people. Now, may I just surmise a few things here and tell you that what he was talking about was sovereignty issues. He was talking about issues of jurisdiction and authority, and what was righteous and what wasn't. And he had tremendous influence, not only on John Witherspoon, but as John Witherspoon had influence on so many, Samuel Rutherford had influence on many as well. He was reformed theologically. He called it full-orbed Christianity. He contended that all of God's creation, rulers and subjects, are expected to be bound by God's law. He believed that human law resulted in abominable situations. Lex Rex, which I said was published in the mid-1600s, was 1644. Rutherford contended whenever God appointed a king, he never appointed him absolute and a sole independent angel, but found him with judges always who were no less to judge according to the law of God than the king, and in a moral obligation of judging righteously the conscience of the monarch. Get this, judging the conscience of the monarch and the conscience of the inferior judges are equally under imminent subjection to the King of Kings. The concept of higher law order was the basis on which the United States was founded. Now, many people don't want to accept that. There are people of different theological understanding, but this is what was influencing the founders. At the same time, he also contended that with monarchs of his time, their quest for absolute power. We've seen this historically. And by the way, if you've ever heard of the teachings of Niccolo Machiavelli, sort of contrary to what Samuel Rutherford was talking about in Lex Rex, and the difference of Lex Rex is Rex Lex. The king is law. And, you know, as an American, and as a man of 60 years plus age, I want to tell you that I'm glad that we have a constitution, that we do have some parameters and so forth, because I know what a bad hair day is. And if it's Rex Lex, the king has a bad hair day and a bad perception, and because his hair is bad, you lose your head. And don't think that hasn't happened in the history of the world, and don't think that our founding fathers were not very well aware of it and understood what that meant. But Machiavelli had this idea. He said he taught it's sometimes better to seem good than to be good. He was talking about some of the politicians today. He believed a leader should seem merciful, faithful, humane, frank, religious, while being ruthless, malicious, and devious. Does that sound like the campaign of 2008? It sort of does to me, and I'm doing that tongue-in-cheek, but I really believe that that's true. And of course, does it remind you of certain organizations like the UN, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, and a few others? And where they think they get their sovereignty from? Rutherford studied Deuteronomy 17 in particular, 20 verses in which number 20 says that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. He was talking about the sovereignty of a ruler, of a king, or of a government leader that was defined, that God had defined it. And it wasn't to be as the kings, for example, like King James of England, thought himself a divine right king. King George III thought himself a divine right king. Well, is there any redress, any petition for a redress of grievance to somebody who says, I am an absolute sovereign monarch, I'm a divine right king, I'm here because God put me here and I cannot be questioned? I mean, does anybody sitting in this room or any other room that they're sitting in want to be part of that? Unless you just happen to be the king that's in that position. And we know that they want that. As many people today in the Senate, I scare a lot of people in the legislature because I sit down beside them and I tell them, I've been reading your voting record. And they don't like that. Some people don't want voting records to be put out there because I said, I don't agree with the theories of Machiavelli. See, I believe in the biblical injunction of Matthew 7:16 and 20 that says, know them by the fruit they bear, not just their rhetoric. Well, some of the other people that were very influential, and you may recognize these names or may not, one was Hugo Grotius. He lived from 1583 to 1645. He was a theologian, a statesman, a Dutch lawyer, and a poet. James Madison called him the father of the modern code of nations. And what God has shown to be his will, that is law.